This is going to be a before and after. You can remember how your brain is right now, and in 15 minutes, it's going to be entirely different. This is all it takes. The reality is that our brain changes all the time. I often give talks to my students or to audiences, and at the end, someone raises their hand and says, you know, I want to know if doing this drug is going to change my brain, or if doing this behavior is going to change my brain. And the reality is that pretty much everything we do changes our brain, because our brain is the part of us that's supposed to change all the time. Our body is pretty much what it is when we were born. We have genetics that kind of define a lot of our traits. And Mother Nature gave us one element, our brain, that's going to adapt to the environment. This thing is actually learning things, changing behavior, and figuring out what is out there so we can do better in the world. So the brain is the kind of machine that I look at in the last couple of years, trying to understand how people's behavior can be changed. I'm going to show you what we know right now about what changes the brain and what the brain changes. And I'll tell you a few things we know recently that you can all apply to indeed train your brain to behave and work better. I like to start talking DLDsummer about the gym, because we all can imagine going to the gym and doing things to our body, but the reality is that while we know a lot about how to change our body, we focus less on things that could actually make our brain be different. And I found this nice Yiddish quote that says that many complain about their looks, but none of their brains. I actually heard people last night saying, I want to stop eating chocolates, I want to stop smoking, I want to exercise more. So all of us have this idea that there's things we want to do differently, and we work on the body a lot, but we don't really know now how to just change the part of us that leads to those desires. So I'm going to show you a little bit of what we know about that. The reality is that we know a lot, and the reality is that also that we can change. So any of you that is in a couple therapy probably heard this thing that says that you cannot change him, who is who he is, and you should just accept who he is. The reality is that you can change some of him, and we're going to see how it's done shortly. So here's some things that we know about changes to the brain. There's a bunch of things that change our brain. And here's kind of the space we're working in. Here are all the things that we can do to our brain that changes it, and I'm going to focus on a few of them and tell you how you can actually do it yourself. But here's things that we know. So we all know that drugs change our brain. And I'm putting in the category of drugs everything that is chemical that goes into our brain, including placebo. Placebo is just another type of chemical that our brain produces to trick itself into changing behavior. And we know that meditation makes some kind of chemical imbalance in the brain that leads to changes. And we know that exercises actually releases all kinds of hormones in our brain that change our behavior. So every part of us that actually induces those hormones in the brain, the chemical ones, changes who we are. We know that nutrition changes our brain, and I imagine that many of you heard that if you eat well and focus on your diet, you're going to have a better life. But the reality is that your brain is also the part of us that wants the sugar and wants the chocolate. So there's a little trick here. So we're going to see in a second how you can work with that. We know also that there's a lot of things in our body that are not our body per se that actually change our brain. So we know that if you look at the cells in your body, 9 out of 10 cells in your body are actually not you. They are bacteria that live in your body and that work with you over time and do things to you, but you cannot really control them unless you connect things to them. So we now have a really fancy study that came out a year ago that took two mice and actually took, and I'm going to speak lightly, they took the poop of one mouse and put it inside the gut of another mouse. And if they took it for a while, what happens is that one mouse became younger. So it somehow took the kind of ingredients that were in one of them, moved it to another, and just by doing that, here's your kind of growth hormone, here's the thing that's going to change perfume. You just eat the poop of your friends who's younger than you, and your brain is going to immediately think it shouldn't be younger. We know that the same works with bloodstream. If you take the blood of one mouse and circulate it into another mouse, the younger mouse becomes older and the older mouse becomes younger. So we know there's something in the gut that goes to our brain, changes it. Something that you can't really apply right away. We know that brain stimulation works. We know that we can actually zap your brain with all kinds of machines from the outside, and those things, if done at the right moment, actually change your behavior. We know that there's all kinds of activities that where you take your brain activity and connect it to a computer and have your brain change something on the computer, and the changes, if they're done right, can actually make your brain work better. This is called brain-computer interfaces. Of course, we know that we can change your genetics. by injecting viruses into your brain and making you behave differently. And we know, of course, that education, talking right now, changes your brains. You actually learn some things, you retain some things in memory, and some things in your brain are now different than they were 2 minutes ago. So it already does something. And a lot of cognitive things work. So if you talk to people, especially a therapist, and they ask the right question at the right time or say the right thing at the right moment, this immediately kind of registers in your brain as a difference, and your brain changes somehow. We know that there's feedback. We can actually get loops of information coming back to the brain in right moments and make these changes. And we know we can even look at the brain as a machine that sits in our head and connects to our world using sensations like the eyes or the ears or the mouth and gets information. And because it sits there and doesn't really know what the world is, it just sees what it gets from the senses, we can actually trick the brain into getting information that's not out there, and in doing so, train it to do different things. So this is the space. But up to now, you're kind of confused. There's too many things, and you don't really know what you should do tomorrow. So let's zoom in and explain a few of the things that you can actually think of yourself. Before I do that, I want to do one risky thing, because some of you here might have tried that, or some of you might be the people who are behind that, and I'm going to risk myself in going to lawsuits by telling you what doesn't work. So here's a few things that don't work, or that aren't proven to work. That's me more accurate. There's a lot of companies out there that will offer you kind of instant brain training. You just go to a website and you play a game, or you play this video game out there, and suddenly you're going to be smarter, you're not going to have Alzheimer, things are going to change. Up to now, there's almost zero evidence that any of those websites and games actually work. I didn't want to tell you myself that I tried a few of them and tested them and found that none of them worked, so I was relying on someone else who did the work, and this way you can sue him, not me, when he says that in a paper in one of the most prestigious journals in science called Nature, in 2010, Adrian Owen, a professor at Cambridge, took a bunch of classic games and websites that some of you probably know of because they're very popular, where people supposedly play games and at the end become smarter or have better memory, and he just tested them in a paper that's called Putting Brain Training to Test. And what he found is this graph, which, without going into too much details, but you see that all the bars are kind of at the same height, which means that before and after, people who did get training, people who did not, they are all the same. What actually happens if you play those games, those websites that teach you that you can kind of train your brain, is that you become really good in those games, and it doesn't translate to anything else. So you can become really good in playing all kinds of card games and memory tasks in this website, and then you try outside to remember the phone number of a person you just met, and you don't know any better. So that's kind of a negative thing. In a way, connecting to the panel just before me on wearable devices, there's a lot of studies right now on all kinds of EEG machines. I intentionally took a picture of one that doesn't try to do that, so I won't get in trouble with anyone here. But there's a lot of companies that offer you a headset that you put on your head, and it's going to tell you what to think of and when to think of things, and in doing so, it's going to train your brain. And again, there's zero to almost little evidence that those things actually work. So right now, I'm telling you, if you're in the investing stage of in a company that's going to use some kind of brain stimulation to make you smarter, take a different gamble, because right now this doesn't seem to work. Okay, so we know that this doesn't work. So the question is, should looking at the brain even be what we're looking into? Or maybe we should just focus on, exercising and dieting and doing other things because our personality is not in the brain. So I want to convince you in 5 minutes first that looking in the brain is essential to your identity and to your behavior, because in your brain lies the roots of who you are. Your behavior, your intentions, your motivations, your love, your desires, your memories, your emotions, everything sits somewhere in your brain. And I'm going to tell you that by showing you a few examples of stories that are going to make you question your free will and whether your brain is yours. Like this story. This is a story of a guy who became famous in the US in the 60s in pretty grave circumstances. In 1966, one day, he takes a cab from his home to the University of Austin in Texas. He gets to university, he climbs the tallest building there, he sits at the top, and then he pulls an AK-47 and he starts spraying people down below. His name is Charles Whitman, and he was one of the first people who were involved in the mass murder. He killed 40 people right away. Then he waited for a while until the ambulance showed up with people to help those people, and then he shot them as well. And he kept for 1 hour sitting there and reloading his rifle and spraying people from above for a while, killing altogether about 80 people and injuring 140, until eventually the police climbed to the building and shot him and killed him. And while he is dead, the police try to figure out what could have led a person to do something like that? What would be the reason behind this behavior? So they went to his neighborhood and tried to investigate. And this was a classical case of a serial killer. He was a great guy, a great neighbor, a great friend. He used to walk the dogs of his neighbors. This is the picture that they found of him, walking the dogs of his neighbors. He was discharged honorably. Not working? Okay. Did you hear anything I said up to now? Okay. It's just very fast. Now it's going to be slow when I speak to the mic. So this guy is a great person. He was discharged honorably from the Marines the year before. Everything about this guy seemed great. They went to his apartment. In his apartment, they found that all of the clothes were color-coded nicely and folded neatly. He was organized. He was perfect. There was no sign of this killing coming until they found his diary. Buried under his bed, they found a little diary that he kept meticulously for the months leading to this event. And in the diary, he started writing things about his brain. He said, my brain is not okay. I feel I'm changing. I'm not myself. He goes to a psychiatrist and he asks this woman to look at him and she says, you're okay, go back home. And he keeps reporting that every day he has awful thoughts. And the night before the killing, he actually writes in his diary, I'm afraid I'm going to do something awful tomorrow. I don't know what it is, but if I do that and I end up dead, I want someone to conduct an autopsy on my brain because it's not okay. And he even leaves a check for $30,000 for this autopsy. So the police says, okay, we're going to do that. And they really look at his brain. And what they find in his brain is a massive tumor resting right at the center on a part of the brain called the amygdala. That has to do with aggression and fear and maybe have led to this behavior. We would never know. But we could know something about this story. The story of a person whose wife calls the police in 2010 and says, my husband, whom I've been married to for 10 years now, and we had a perfectly normal and great sexual relationship for the last 10 years, he woke up one morning and he became a pedophile. I don't know what to do. He's a pedophile. We have a 4-year-old daughter, and I'm worried about her. You've got to arrest my husband. So the police says, okay, this is kind of an extreme case. They indeed arrest the husband because they find child porn in his computer, and he goes on trial, and the trial begins, and he complains as the trial begins about having some headaches. They ignore it first on day 1, they ignore it on day 2, but on day 3 he has a seizure in the courthouse. So now they take him right away and they rush him to the medical center where they look at his brain, and what they see in his brain is a massive tumor resting on the left front of his brain, a part of the brain that has to do with decision making. And they say, okay, this is a massive tumor, we've got to cure this guy. So they take him from the emergency room to the operating room where a doctor removes the entire residue from the tumor. And what's interesting about this case is that when this guy wakes up after a few days from the surgery, no longer is he having a tumor, but even more interesting, he no longer is a pedophile. He goes back to his normal sexual appetite. So instead of being sent to prison, the judge sends him back home on probation. And the story could already end here and be interesting, but it actually has a twist that makes it even more interesting. Because 10 months later, after this guy is at home, the wife calls again and says, my husband is again a pedophile. We've got to do something about it. This time they know what to do. They take him straight to the hospital, look at his brain, and what they see is that part of the tumor wasn't taken out. There's a residue that's still there that grew back, so his pedophile behavior arrived again. They take him to surgery a second time. They remove this residues from the tumor, and as he wakes up a second time, he goes back to his normal sexual appetite. This is almost like a controlled experiment. You have to think one way, you behave one way, you take it out, you behave differently, you bring it back, you behave one way, and so on. So this just shows to you that indeed looking at the brain is actually a place that we can understand behavior. And you don't have to look that far into cases like these two guys that pretty much had a very extreme situation. You can all imagine yourself this afternoon going to the cocktail event and pouring some ethanol on your mucosal glands, and suddenly everything around you becomes funnier and everyone becomes cuter. You all saw these moments where changes to our brain lead to changes to our behavior. And the question now is, can we somehow control those changes? Okay, so when I wanted to look at changes like that, I was interested in the type of changes that people care about. And what I specifically wanted to see is, what do people actually want to get with those changes? Because we can change a lot of things, but what do people actually want to arrive at the end? And the answer that most people give us is happiness. So people want to be happy. Okay, that's great. But the question is, how do you get to happiness? And what behavior would lead you to happiness? So I didn't have to look far, because people before me studied happiness. And they actually arrived at a number of things that drive happiness. And I want to ask you to participate with me in this kind of little survey and tell me what you think are the top 5 things that make people happy. Let's start from the kind of top to the bottom, but you can guess anything. What are the 5 things that you think make people happy? Freedom, we have 1. Not in the top 5. What else? Love, not in the top 5. Friends is number 2. Family. So friends and family go into the same category of interaction. Health. Connection, you said? Weather. Let's start with number 5 and we go climb after. So here's number 5, the fifth thing that actually drives happiness. Exercise. This is not surprising. We know that running and jogging and doing activity actually releases hormones in the brain that makes us that actually increases our happiness. This is not surprising. Let's go to number 4. That's a lot more surprising and I think a lot more relevant to the audience here, given what Steffi said yesterday about social behavior. Turns out volunteering is one of the most things that make us happier. So doing things for others not only helps others, but it turns out that when you come back home and you just look at people's behavior, brain-wise, it turns out that the brain is just better and much more engaged and much more active when we are done doing things for others. So that's a pretty positive thing. Let's look at the worst thing now, spirituality. Turns out that being spiritual, regardless of what religion you're part of or what spirituality you're engaged in, it actually makes the brain a lot better. So if you're one of those people who believes in something, you're already much better than us, people who don't believe, because it gives your brain a little bit of the thing that gives meaning to life. You just kind of think that the world has a greater meaning than what it is, and it actually ties closely to number 2, which is social interaction. So it turns out our brain really loves to get inputs and outputs from the outside, to get inputs from the outside world and retrieve outputs. So the brain, when it's processing information that's not its, information that came out from the outside world, it actually changes itself a lot, and it makes us happier. So, and this ties to family, friends, any social interaction. It doesn't matter with whom, and love is part of it, actually makes our brain behave better. And accordingly, I think number 3 is now explained well, because if you're spiritual, you actually feel that you're never alone. There's always someone with you. Even when you go to bed by yourself, there's kind of someone in there with you. So this, I think, is why number 3 actually is there. But number 1 is the interesting thing that none of you guessed, and I didn't guess. And this drives much of what I'm going to tell you in the next 10 minutes, which is how you actually change your behavior. And it turns out that the thing that makes us happiest the most, the thing that is above everything else, that controls happiness more than anything else, is sleep. Turns out that having a better sleep is correlated highly with having much more happiness, more than anything else. And there's a little trick here, because we don't really know if it's correlation or causation. It's unclear if people that are happy sleep better, or people that sleep better are happy. But regardless of that, we all know that people that are actually reporting higher happiness all report better sleep. And what I mean by better sleep is not that necessarily they sleep for more hours. They just wake up feeling that they slept enough. So if you sleep 10 hours but you wake up tired, or if you sleep 4 hours and you wake up very, very alert, the number of hours doesn't matter. What matters is how you wake up. And sleep is interesting, because what's interesting about sleep is that sleep is a moment where our brain is in many ways shut down. We're not really there to control things. We're just kind of sitting there and our brain does things. And somehow, this makes us happy. And this is interesting, because this is what we learned recently, is the moment where changes could occur in the best way. When we're sleeping, we're not there to resist things. So if you target the right moments in your sleep and you do things to your brain, that's when the changes could happen in the best way. And here's what I mean by that. I'm going to now list a few of the studies, all from the last three or four years. And what's common to all of them is that they actually lead to changes in the behavior. They're part of the big space of things I showed you before. And what's nice about them is that they actually were working in different states of our work, of our life. So here's one type of change we all want to do. Learning content. We all imagine to go to sleep one day and wake up knowing Chinese, or go to sleep for a little nap in the afternoon and wake up knowing Kung Fu. The reality is that we don't know yet how to do that, but we do know how to use your sleep to make sure the things that you learn yourself stay there. Turns out that in our sleep, there's many, many stages. If we go to a sleep, for even a nap of 90 minutes, there's different stages that we're going through. And one of those stages is called slow wave sleep. It's a stage where our brain basically does the following thing. It takes information from one side of the brain, things that we learn during the day, and picks the ones that it thinks are important and saves them for later. So it says, okay, this thing that I learned today is important. I want to retrieve that. I want to store it, so it's going to be there in the future. And if we target the brain in that particular moment and tell the brain, this is important, your brain is going to take information and store it in the brain. So all we have to do now is the following. We have to, during the daytime, learn something as in read a book, look at a movie, listen to someone talking. And in doing that, we're all going to put things in our own brain. And now we go to sleep. And in our sleep, we have to have someone do the right thing. I'm going to tell you what it is in a second. And if you do the right thing at the right time, our brain thinks that this thing is important, and it just saves it. So we now have a bunch of studies, all from the last year, that show that we can actually make your brain retain information if we target information in the right moment. And I'll show you a few other studies. So about 2 months ago, a study came up that showed how you can actually make people stop smoking. So people stop smoking for a while. People try to stop smoking for a while. There's been a lot of ways to do that. A study from a group of a guy called Moran Cerf showed the following thing. They took people who were smokers. They brought them to the lab, and they told them to go to sleep for 90 minutes. In the specific window that I called slow wave sleep, it's a specific window that is easy to identify. Those people, where they were sleeping, had someone spray the smell of nicotine, the smell of cigarettes, into their nose, and immediately afterwards, the smell of rotten eggs. So you go to sleep, you get to the right moment, someone sprays the smell of cigarettes, and immediately after, a bad smell. It doesn't have to be rotten eggs, but it could be anything. And what your brain does is it learns quickly that this thing is bad. So just spraying a few times this particular smell that you don't want to have anymore and a bad smell afterwards makes your brain associate the experience with as a bad thing. And when those people wake up, not only do they not want to sleep, they don't smoke, they actually don't want to. Somehow their brain learned that smoking is something that they don't really want, and they just wake up not wanting to smoke as much. So these people were asked to keep a diary. Half the people were going through this treatment where they were learning that smoking is not something that they want, half were not, and what they show is that there's a drop in the people who got the treatment in their amount of smoking. So we can actually now think of anything that you don't want to have. You don't like chocolate, you want to not eat my chocolate. We now go again, let you take a nap. In the right window of time, slow wave sleep, we spray the smell of chocolate into your nose, and immediately after a bad smell, and your brain, if you do it enough times in the right moment, is going to wake up really learning that this thing is not something that it wants. We don't know if it's reversible, so if you're not sure if you don't like chocolate, you might not do it right away, but if you really have a behavior that you want to stop, we now know that this particular thing came out a few months ago, actually leads to a change in the behavior. Here's another example, biases. In a study that came out about 4 weeks ago, in science, what they show is that the same window, the same unique window of sleep isn't just about changing behavior actively like eating, it can also change your biases. What they did is they took people and they measured all kinds of associations inside their head, and they showed that people have some kind of racial biases. So some people actually have all kinds of tendencies that even if they don't themselves think they're racist, they actually have those racial biases in their brain. When they got to the specific moment in the sleep, they played into their ear just words that are reversing the associations. And again, it's important that it happens in the right moment in slow wave sleep, and it doesn't wake you up. And when those people wake up, they take a test, and in the test, they show less tendencies for those associations. So we know now that this window of sleep is good for changing behavior like smoking, like eating, biases, and even for learning. We can now have you learn history when you're awake, and when you get to this particular moment, we're just going to play a little bit of sounds that remind you of history. It's going to make your brain take information out there and save it in your brain. So what they did, another study, they took people and they had them learn some things, very basic, some words in Chinese and the translation to English. They waited for the right moment. While the person was asleep, they played only the Chinese words, not the English one, and the brain just rehearsed that, and when they wake up in the morning, the words that were rehearsed were remembered, and the words that were not remembered. So here's what you always wanted, a way to actually change your brain in a very active way by targeting slow wave sleep. The problem there, it's really hard to find this moment called slow wave sleep. So what you have to do is you have to find a partner that stays next to you in bed, wait for you to get to the right moment, and when you're asleep, spray this thing into your nose or whisper the right word in your ear, and then when you wake up, you're going to do this thing, and it has to do it every 90 minutes. Not easy to do, but actually the tools that we use in our lab to measure sleep stages is not too hard, so you can actually train your husband or your wife or your boyfriend or your spouse to stay up and do that for you. It's a nice gesture for one night in return for forever eternal non-love for chocolate. Okay, we also know now that we can toy with the brain when it comes to engagement. So engagement is a word that a lot of people care about, and we now have tools using neuroscience to actually look at the brain and learn when your brain is more likely to retain information and less likely. And this is really important. It's important for education, for instance. When we educate people right now in class, we still use the same method that people used 200 years ago, which is one person speaking to another. But the reality is that when I speak to you right now, I probably speak too fast for 40% of the people, too slow for 10%, and just the right speed for some of you. But that's the method we teach people right now. We just have one person speak to a lot of people, and we assume that somehow they're going to catch up. And this is very outdated. It means that in our classroom, we have to assume that 40 people in the classroom are all the same person. But now we can actually look at their brain and see exactly what's the right moment that they're more engaged or less engaged, and maybe create teachers that are better for this guy than that girl, or students that go well in this subject but not in that subject, and actually start creating classrooms not based on just the age group or the success in tests, but on the right moment for our brain to capture things. And since we know now how to look at the brain and measure engagement, we can actually look at a person as an individual and rank people by engagement levels and find teachers that work best with those students. We also know how to make you forget stuff. Turns out that when we remember something, we don't just load stuff from our hard drive and use it and store it back, we actually change it. So every time I ask you a question and you go to your memory and kind of pull something to tell me the answer, you actually pull the memory and it's floating in the air and it's kind of very malleable, it's very fragile. So if I ask you right now, how was it to be a 4-year-old? Let's say I'm asking you, Steffi, how it was to be a 4-year-old. You say, oh, it was amazing. I was riding bicycle, and I was learning this thing, and I was playing in the sandbox. In order to tell me that thing, you had to go back to your memory and kind of pull information, keep it in mind, and tell it to me. In this particular moment, it's very fragile. As soon as you're done telling it, you're going to save it again. But what you're going to save is not the original. You're going to save the thing you open with some changes that come from the right moment. So every time you remember something, you actually pull it and save it again. Pull it and save it again, which means that if we intervene in the right moment, we can actually make your memory changed. Which means also that if I ask you tomorrow how it was to be a 4-year-old, the answer is not going to be, again, just pulling from back in the past. It's going to be the last time you saved it and how it was. So telling a story many, many times actually means you change it a lot. There's a joke among neuroscientists that the best memories are kept in the brain of people with Alzheimer because they never use the memories. They're just kind of kept there the way it was, and they never use them. So if you can just get in, you can get the memory in the raw form. But all of us are always changing it, so we get the kind of the worst version of our memories. We just keep changing them all the time. So if you want to remember something, you just have to keep it there and not touch it. But the reality is we do touch it all the time, and this means that we can actually now find a moment and ask you a question and make you remember something, and just when you talk about it, intervene, and in doing so, we make you save it in a different way. This is basically what therapy does for you, right? You go to a therapist, they ask you about your boyfriend and why he dumped you, you answer the question, and they say, well, maybe he didn't really think that, and just by doing that, they make you save the memory in a little different version. This is what we do with trauma people that have post-traumatic stress. They come back, they had some bad experience, we ask them to talk about the experience, and we intervene in the middle of the talk and make them save it differently. Now we understand how memory works, we can actually understand why those therapies work, but we can also do it in a very aggressive way by making you tell us a story and intervene medically right when you tell the story and make you not save it, so you basically forget it entirely. Now, again, this is something that we did up to now with animals like rats and mice and monkeys, and we know that it works. The question of doing it with humans is a bit tricky because we don't know that erasing memories is good or bad for you. We know that there's things that call preemptive medicine, and we can actually look at your brain and see when your brain is vulnerable to things and change them. We know that we can also look at your brain and learn how risks work. We know that your brain actually has internal mechanisms that assess risks and evaluate them, and not all of them are available to us. So when we come to make a stock whether to invest in something or not to invest in something, we basically assess a lot of information and we make a decision. But the reality is that in our brain, there's a lot of other processes that work together to make a decision, and not all of them are available to us. Now we can put electrodes in your brain and see what's involved and what's not involved in the decision, and actually help you understand how you make decisions better, and give you information about the way you made decisions yesterday, and help you know how to make it in a different way. I'm going to mention that in a second in the last slide. And we also know that we can help your brain think better of the future. So we know that our brain is really good in thinking about the present and understanding what's going on right now, but it's not really great in thinking about the far future. We know that we're not really good in saving money. We're not really good in not eating things right now, so they're going to be healthy in the future. And we know that we're really bad in climate change because now it's really fun to just throw things on the ground, and we don't really think that it's going to be different in 100 years when our kids are going to be there. What we can do right now is we can actually trick your brain into thinking it's in the future, and actually simulating fast-forward movement in the brain such that you really live different times within your life. We can actually think of yourself at different ages, and in doing so, you actually are better in controlling yourself. And I'm going to finish by talking about the one thing which is called self-control, which is the ability for the brain to control itself. And I'll do that by, oops, I went backwards. By showing you the last study that we did, and that's I'm going to end with that. I get the signs I should end soon. And we really wanted to know if we can change people's behavior in a way that's going to make them better. And we wanted to do that in various ways, and we took one that's kind of interesting, which is working with people whose brain is different than anyone else's, which are athletes. So what we did is we took people, and we partnered with a company that's known for having a lot of access to athletes, and we had people, elite athletes, come to the lab and exercise. We told them one thing. We told them we wanted to go on the treadmill and start on the stationary bike and exercise for a while, and we have one request from you. Please don't ever stop. Go. The person says, sorry, what? Say, just exercise and don't stop until I tell you to. Just continue until I tell you to stop. And the person exercises for a while and make it harder and harder for them. Eventually, they break. And what we care about is looking at their brain just before they break. So the reality is that when you start cycling, your legs say no problem, and your brain says exercise, and they kind of works together. But after 1 mile, your legs say, please stop, and your brain says continue. And after 2 miles, the leg says, please stop, and the brain says continue. And at some point, you get to the moment where your brain really struggles against your feet and your leg, and eventually the leg wins, and you just stop. And the question is, how does the brain look at this moment? What we did is we took those athletes, and we look at their brain just before they broke. We also took a lot of things. I'm going to skip that so you won't just look at that. And we look at the brain when they broke, and we saw how the brain of an athlete looks just before she or he break. And we saw that compared to regular people. And what we found is like the way the brain looks when you're about to break. And what we took is regular people out there. We bring them to the lab and we had them exercise on a treadmill. But this time we told them, just before you're about to break, we tell you. So you're exercising on a treadmill and you're about to stop, and we tell you, now is the moment where you're about to stop. Continue for 1 more minute. So we basically train them by now, not by looking at their muscles, but on their brain. So it doesn't matter to me if you run for 1 mile or for 10 miles, but I will know when your brain is about to give up, and I'm going to tell you now to stay for 1 minute longer. And this is training you not by your muscles, but by your brain. Basically, I'm going to give you an indication that your brain is about to collapse and make you do further. And what we do when we do that is we seem to see that after very little training, we can take any person and make them look like an athlete. They just continue a little longer. And this also changes your body, but it actually shows you that you can control the brain differently. So now you might ask yourself, okay, so there's a lot of things that I heard and they're interesting. I might ask my spouse to spray smell at me when I'm sleeping, but what can I actually do tomorrow that works? And the reality is that we can do a lot of things right away. And that is, we can learn our own brain. And the reality is that in the room, there's a couple of dozens of people here, and all brains are different. And I can't give you just like one answer that says, here's what to do to make your brain better. But all of you have different brains that fall into one category, and we can actually help you find what brain you have to change yourself in the most accurate way for yourself. And what we'll see from looking at all those athletes and the people we work with is that every brain is a little different, but all brains are the same in the sense that when they get to a moment of conflict or a moment of trajectory or fork in the road, they actually employ all kinds of things to make a decision. For instance, we see that some people make better decisions in the morning, some in the evening. Some when they're hungry, some when they're full. Some when they're sad, some when they're happy. Some after talking to a lot of people, some after talking to themselves. Some close to the deadline, some far ahead. And all of you know what brain you have. So what you need to do as a first step is to keep a diary. Just walk life for a week with a diary. And every time you get to a fork in the road, make a decision and write the decision that you made, and write also your state. Write what were your brain conditions at that moment. Were you happy, sad? Were you angry? Were you hungry? And just keep a diary. At the end of the week, look back you can see of all your decisions, which ones you were happy with, which ones you're not, and just see which one they are. What we look at in our athletes and our patients, we seem to see that there's kind of a state of their brain that is really good for making decisions, and some that are very, very bad. And all we have to do is we just ask them, of decisions you made last week, which ones were you happy with and which ones were you not? Look at your brain and take a snapshot of the brain at those moments and tell them something about the ways by which they should behave next time when they make decisions. And this is kind of what leads to good brains. I opened with showing this quote and the picture of the gym, and I kind of made an analogy that your brain is kind of like another muscle that you can train. But this picture I put there for a different reason. This is a picture from a gym in Los Angeles where people came to exercise, and they had two options. They either could take the stairs up to exercise or take the escalators. And even though they all came to exercise, they all came to train, there was an option that was very easy out there, and they just picked the easy option. The reality is that we live in a world right now that makes things easy for us, and it kind of caters to our faulty brains. Instead of fixing our brain, we just give our brains all kinds of ways to go and ignore the problems. We created the enemy of all brains, which is the snooze button. Right? We go to sleep, we set the alarm to 6 a.m., and the alarm rings at 6 a.m. and we wake up and we just don't same people anymore. Suddenly there's a different brain who wakes up and doesn't want to wake up anymore. And instead of fixing our brain, we created a button that works just with that. A button we can press that just gives the brain a little more time. Instead of learning how to make our brain better, we created a world that doesn't train our brain, but actually trains our bodies to live in this thing. And this makes for a world that actually is functional for us, but also lets our brain not work hard, which means that we're kind of getting less and less good in controlling it. And I think that the best thing we can do right now for our brain is learn how it works and actually work against it, as in train it, rather than give into it and just create all kinds of escalators next to gyms or snooze buttons to make things better for us. Thank you.